Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone got a drink because they're available right back there. As I just want to say a couple of words to emphasize what Deirdre already mentioned. At the center, we very much encourage people to exercise their rights, particularly their free speech rights. So it's particularly a privilege for me to be here in the company of people who are regularly exercising those rights on our behalf, on behalf of the American public. So we definitely are at what I think is a pivotal moment in history for free speech. It's a moment when Josh Fox is arrested at the Capitol. DC gets such a bad rap. I promise you, I'm based in DC. I promise you there are those of us in DC who are not evil and who just live there and have normal lives. But also, you know, Lee Hirsch has to battle to prevent his film, The Bully Project, from getting an R rating when Laura Poitras is harassed by Homeland Security and her equipment and computers are confiscated without cause and without warrant. And really importantly for independent filmmakers, when our public media is in crisis and is no longer providing one of the largest outlets for distribution of independent film. And it strikes me as sort of a moment of self-censorship. It's not really even the government, it's these other interests which are made up of the public, of us, which we're a part of, that seems to be preventing this from happening. So anyway, we have these amazing champions of free speech here, and I hope that you'll enjoy what they have to say. Two of the films represented here have not yet been screened, so I thought that it would be best for us to start with introductions. So if you guys could tell us just a little bit about yourselves and then kind of introduce the films so some people have some context. And we'll start with Judith.
My name's Judith Ehrlich. I made a film called The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which was singled out as the longest title in the nominees section at the Academy Awards. Very bad at titles. That film was about the most famous whistleblower of the 20th century, who's still at it, is arrested regularly for civil disobedience, just celebrated his 81st birthday a couple days ago. And just before his 80th birthday, I said, Dan, you're gonna be 80 in 2 weeks. You've been arrested 80 times for civil disobedience. Don't get arrested between now and then. He got arrested twice that week in front of the White House, chained to the gate. So he keeps at it, and it's a real story about courage, which I think is really what all of these films are about that the rare person who's willing to stand up and fight for free speech. This is, just briefly, I'm working on a film now that's about freedom of speech on the internet, which is, I think, going to be our next real challenge, because even though we believe we have rights in the real world, we don't have those rights in the cyber world, and I think we're going to have a huge fight in front of us in the next period of time to preserve the freedoms that we have under the Constitution in the world that we now live in.
Hello. I'm Fredrik, Gertten, Swedish filmmaker based in Sweden. I did a film called Bananas, where I was following a court case in LA where banana workers from Nicaragua were suing Dole Food Company for the use of a pesticide that was banned in the US, and they kept using it there, and the workers claimed that they got sterile. Well, they got sterile. That film premiered at the LA Film Festival in June 2009, or was supposed to premiere, because just a month before we received the cease and desist letter from Dole Food Company. And the festival and all their sponsors received the same letters. Every single sponsor got this letter, which kind of started a big turmoil, and we got kicked out of competition, and in the end the film was screened, but with a huge disclaimer in front of the film. So it became my whole life for a long time, like 2 years, to take this fight, to defend my film. And at one moment, well, you know, we filmmakers are like writers. We defend ourselves with a camera. So I decided to document part of this journey. And after a while, I understood, wow, there's a film here, and this film is actually, it's about free speech. It's about what a big corporation is ready to do in order to protect its brand, because it's all about brand. And they don't only attack with lawyers, because they sued us. They also attack with PR spin. So they have huge PR companies, huge PR budgets that goes against us. So it's so my film is a lot about PR and lobbyists and the power, and actually also about the traditional media losing out, journalists losing their self-confidence, and the PR people getting more and more confident. So I think my film is important. It can play a good role in debate about free press and the role of the bot people, the PR people. I think we should talk about that. The film premiered at Sundance, and it's now traveling everywhere, and me too. It's fun, but it's also kind of takes a lot of time. But I'm really happy to be here. That's a film which will be played here tomorrow, so, and to be here with great colleagues too.
My name is Bernardo Ruiz. I directed a film called REPORTERO, which is about a group of journalists in Tijuana in northern Mexico who've been covering the drug war, but really looking at the links between organized crime and local politicians in northern Mexico, and with some very serious consequences. The film is touring in Mexico at the moment. I'm thrilled to be able to premiere here in the US, and it will also be a part of the Human Rights Watch Film Festival, and also will be on POV in the fall. It's a huge honor for me to be sitting next to two of these amazing filmmakers. I've seen both of their films in different contexts, and have followed Fredrik's film very closely. I'm a big supporter of the film, and we have a mutual friend who's a filmmaker, feature filmmaker, and one of the things that we always talk about is that the importance of Bananas is that it's a film that challenges the official story. And I think that's something that's, it's a parallel in all of these projects, and I think in a lot of documentary work in general, the space, needing the space and the room to be able to challenge the official story. Unfortunately, so much journalism in this country, and in Mexico too, where my film is set, is almost stenographic. The PR machine, the infotainment machine is very large, and so I'm excited to be a part of this panel discussion that's about celebrating those spaces or those groups of people who really do challenge those official narratives. One thing that I think is interesting for a U.S. audience here is one of the things that I think my film does is it shows the consequences of direct censorship. So in my film, 3 journalists are murdered for reporting on organized crime or for outing organized crime figures or powerful corrupt politicians. So it's a very clear story about direct censorship. What we're struggling with in this country at this moment in time is a story about soft censorship. It's a different animal, but to see it very clearly in a mirror in another country is an interesting example. And Mexico in many ways is a mirror to this country. So I think that would be the only other thing that I would want to touch on is this, this idea of soft censorship, self-censorship, and interests kind of shifting the debate or entirely neglecting pieces of the debate. I think the last thing I would add to that is that one of the things that the journalists in my film always complain about is the lack of journalism, hard investigative journalism about the drug war in this country. It's as if when these trucks cross into the United States with tons of methamphetamine and cocaine, they suddenly vanish. Who's doing the reporting on the distribution networks in this country? Who's following the money? Where do all these narco dollars go? So that money has to be banked somewhere. Where's the hard investigative journalism on those stories? So there's quite a bit of attention paid to Mexico, and and the very horrific violence, and with good reason. But where's the other piece of the story?
Thank you. Self-censorship, I think, is one of the greatest dangers that we face in not exercising our fair use rights. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I just have a couple of initial questions. I'm going to turn it over to the audience pretty quickly because I know you all want to talk to these great filmmakers, but I'll just get us started. Judith, I wanted to start with you because your film has come out first out of all of these. I believe it was 2007?
No.
2010. 2010?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I know for me, when I saw your film, coming from the generation after the Pentagon Papers, it was so important for me to understand why they were so monumental, having not lived through it. So I'm very curious to know from your perspective why it was so important for you to tell that story.
Well, I think it was a story that needed to be told for a long time, and when we came upon the subject, well, Dan ELLSBERG lives in Berkeley, as I do, so I knew him casually, and I always one day woke up and thought, how come no one's ever made a film about Dan ELLSBERG and the Pentagon Papers? And just at that moment, 4 other filmmakers wanted to make it. So we took us 6 months to convince the ELLSBERGs that we were the right team to make it. So that was the first step. But it was so obviously an important story. And I think he had not wanted to participate in it because until he wrote his autobiography, which he had just done at that time, a book called Secrets. So I think once he got to that point, he was willing to entertain the idea, and then we had to get in line to him. We were very lucky to be able to be the ones to tell the story. But his story really is, I think, the pivotal story of a whistleblower, the classic story of a whistleblower. And I think that for me, whistleblowing is like the last stand in a democracy when our right to free speech has failed, when our system isn't working. And I was thinking, watching your film today, that whistleblowers are the ones who really help us get the truth. You know, without whistleblowers, we're never going to know what's really going on, because it's certainly the powerful are not going to reveal that to us. And I'm also reminded of it's Noam Chomsky who said it's not a matter of speaking truth to power. The powerful already know the truth. And I think that we really need to remember that we need to know the truth. They know what they've done. We need to have people who open that door, and Dan was the most important one in the 20th century.
Which is why the independent voices are so essential.
Yes, and one more thing, when I was watching your film, I was thinking about how just telling the truth doesn't always solve the problem. And you know, your people tell the truth and nothing happens. You know, the Attorney General, or what's the Attorney General, who was the mafia guy. And in Daniel Ellsberg's case, he told the truth about the Vietnam War, and it went on for 5 more years. So I think we also have to tell the truth and be patient and keep knocking at the door and keep demanding that the right thing be done.
Right. And it's so important to keep telling those stories. I mean, I think we went through the same thing with weapons of mass destruction, right? How many, I mean, the wars were arguably still going on. Thank you for that. Bernardo, I wanted to turn to you to ask more about context. Well, one of the many things that was really striking about your film for me was what a cautionary tale it is, an ongoing cautionary tale, especially in America where we may take our free speech rights for granted. I was wondering if you could talk to us about the Mexican context for free speech. What are the rights that should be guaranteed, and what is the structure that's degrading, that's not allowing people to exercise them?
Well, I think what the journalists in my film, in Reportero, tell us is that in the 80s, in the 1970s and 1980s in Mexico, the fear about censorship came from the government, so by the ruling institutional party, the PRI. And that was the big fear. And there was actually very direct censorship from the Mexican government, to the point where the government controlled paper sales in Mexico. So if they liked what you printed, they would sell you paper, and if they didn't, they would just up the rates, or they also controlled unions. So there were very direct mechanisms of control in Mexico, very obvious mechanisms of control. Beginning in the kind of early 90s, and certainly by the late 90s, that center, that censorship begins to come from various sources, but principally organized crime and its links to kind of official power. So what the journalists have said to me is that it's, the consequences have become more dire, but it's more dispersed and more erratic and much more difficult to judge what's going to provoke a reaction from organized crime. There's a very famous case about 2 years ago where a newspaper in the city of Juarez, which has seen, in many ways, seen the worst of the narco violence in Mexico, a newspaper called El Diario de Juarez, which published an open letter to the cartels and said, look, we're tired of losing our reporters. What do you want us to publish? Just tell us what you want us to publish. We're sick of this. And people have continued to receive threats and continue to be threatened in very direct ways in that newspaper. So I think in Mexico, it's very difficult, according to the reporters, to find a logic or a consistency to the terror. But it's there. What they always keep telling me, and what you see a little bit of in the film is, we do our piece. We do our piece of the puzzle. This is our job. But it's up to the judicial system, it's up to the citizenry, it's up to all of these other members of civil society to do their part. And that's the part that you can't control. We as journalists can do our job, but it's up to these institutions and people to take it further.
In this case, that would be everyone sitting in this room. So I also want to follow up to ask, is the film going to be screened at all in Juarez, and what are the potential repercussions for that?
So we've actually, the film's been on tour in Mexico. It's on a 12-city tour of Mexico that's organized by a really fantastic festival called Ambulante, which was started by Diego Luna and Gael Garcia, the two actors who were in Casa de Mi Padre with Will Ferrell. But they're very active in social justice circles, and they started this incredible festival, and they take films all over Mexico and they do free public screenings. So we've now screened in, I think, maybe 10 cities in Mexico, including Tijuana, where the film is set, in Mexico City. For obvious reasons, we were very concerned about the reaction in those places. But I've been very happy to report that we've received a groundswell of support from Mexico. It's not that the film itself is a perfect film or that it's an amazing film. It's rather that I think there's such a hunger for this particular story. And it's the right time for this story in Mexico, and so we've received a tremendous amount of support from social media, from student organizations, and from this tour. So I'm really excited that it's being exhibited all over Mexico and starting in May in Central America as well.
And Fredrik, I saved you for last out of the three because yours is such a unique and appalling case of being censored when you tried to screen the film in the US, or at least the attempt to be censored. And I definitely caught the moment in the film where you said that you hired the film crew because you were waiting essentially to be served. Well, I want to hear more about what was going through your head. At what point did you know that this was going to be the next film? And how did you make that decision under what I imagine must have been great financial strain to keep the cameras rolling during this entire period?
Well, I didn't know if I was going to do a new film, but we filmmakers, we know that if there is something really strong going on where you're able to catch it, you catch it because you might be able to use it. So I guess all of us has material in the wardrobe that could have been part of the film and never come, So it's more a filmmaker instinct to catch stories. Then to decide to do a film is a different story. And what should this film be about? And that's an even more complicated story. And then how to finance it, it's almost impossible. Especially this one was really, really hard to finance. No American sources came out because of the chilling effect. I mean, the chilling effect, it's something that I understand it more and more. For me, doing this film was also almost like a shock therapy. Going back to LA, understand what happened to me. I mean, because you know, you haven't seen the film, so it's hard for you to understand yet. But I mean, I was interviewed by most major media when I was at LA Film Festival, but the journalists attacked me. I was the villain. They tried to trap me. I expected my colleagues to be on my side. I was kind of stupid, maybe. But Dole had created such a good spin. They created a story about a naive Swedish filmmaker who had made a crook into a hero. And now he refused to admit that he had done wrong. And that story was so well done, so it also traveled out into the documentary world. Also, film bloggers, a lot of people in our own community told that story. Ha ha, have you heard about the Swedish filmmaker? It's a funny story. You know, we are pretentious do-gooders. It's funny when these pretentious people do wrong, you know? We like that, it's a good story. And they made it work for them. And it's also, I mean, it meant for my film Bananas that the story, I mean, we haven't had the big success in this country. I mean, it's now, I mean, ITVS, I don't know if you know what ITVS is, but it's they fund film for public TV, and they had paid $150,000. They still haven't broadcasted the film. So I mean, Dole made that happen. And what I understood doing this film is the scare culture in this country. People are so afraid. And in Mexico for obvious reasons. And in many other countries for obvious reasons. But here, people are still scared for losing the job, losing the Medicare, losing whatever. I mean, that shocked me, and it still shocks me. And of course, people are also afraid in Sweden and many other countries. I mean, there are a lot of coward people everywhere. That's more the rule, of course. But I expected that I should get more support. Then I understand I'm not American, nobody knows about me. There's a lot of, I mean, if I was an American filmmaker, more famous, I could probably get more support. But Dole did that really well and isolated me. And that harmed the film. And what is the film? The film is the story about banana workers getting harmed. You know, that was the story. You know, Dole didn't want you to know about the effects of Dole's work in Central America. And it's classical to, you know, if you want to shift the focus, I mean, that's what Daniel Ellsberg and all these people have experienced before. You create a story where the reporter or the whistleblower suddenly is almost a criminal or a stupid person.
Well, I can't help but think about Julian Assange. I mean, and the Swedish connection, but also just making him into the PR that's been unleashed against him has been pretty phenomenal. And Bradley Manning, the alleged leaker of the information. I think there's a huge machine out there trying to discredit.
So there's maybe also a reason to be scared.
Yeah, sure. Truth tellers are pretty dangerous to the system.
So do you think we're now kind of in a place where whistleblowers no longer have the efficacy that they did perhaps when Daniel Ellsberg was?
Well, I just have to mention, because I think most people aren't aware of this, and Daniel, channel him a lot of the time when it comes to this subject, and he always says this, which is that President Obama, as much as we like him in many ways, has been the worst president in American history on whistleblowing, and he's indicted 6 whistleblowers, and up to that point, in all of current previous history, there have only been 3 whistleblowers indicted. So he's gone way out of his way to really come down on this issue and to make it more difficult to blow the whistle. These are national security whistleblowers.
It's scary.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Especially as a constitutional lawyer.
One thing I just wanted to add to Fredrik's point too is that I think that the frightening part is when the conversation is eliminated. So it's if there were some factual inaccuracies, which I personally don't believe there were in your film, but if there were, then why don't you just have a conversation? Why not have the film out in the world, and why don't you challenge it on a journalistic level?
On the merits.
On the merits of the story. What happens is you have this wave of attack, and I saw the blog attacks, and it was very disappointing. Some very high-profile U.S. bloggers who didn't have the full information went after the film in a very vitriolic way. But you know, as documentary makers, it seems like our primary responsibility is to provoke dialogue, and for there to be a, to heighten our awareness of reality, and for there to be a robust discussion around these issues. And what happens when you just slam down a door on a film? At minimum, we should be having a responsible discussion about these issues. So the fact that the door came down so hard on Fredrik's film, it says something. Something was provoked there to make that door come down so hard.
Well, and it says something about the crisis of our media on many different levels. You know, the crisis of ownership, of propaganda, but also of the responsibility of journalists to tell both sides of the stories. One of the things from Fredrik's film that was really striking to me was how quickly everyone just associated the film with being fraudulent. Right away, it was billed as the fraudulent film without anyone ever having seen it. And without, questioning whether or not it was fraudulent, and if that can occur for a film which hasn't even come out of obscurity yet, right? It hadn't premiered yet. Then what does that say about the rest of the news that we're being fed? And as citizens, I think we have that responsibility to question and to push our media to ask, to be critical. And on that note, I'd like to open it up to the audience. Please go ahead.
A couple of things about Judith's film, which, by the way, is the most provocative political thriller that I've ever seen. It opened up, so I was kind of a student of Woodward and Bernstein and all this stuff. But you know what happened? Like when Ellsberg was, in fact, when the information got out, nothing happened. But what happened is 3 weeks later, the Watergate burglars broke in to an office to try and get Ellsberg's medical records, and as a result of that, Nixon fell 4 years later. But it did, in fact, promote his fall. It just took a little more time. The other point you made about Obama and the whistleblowers, one of the reasons that that's happened is because constitutionally, only twice in the history of this country have we suspended the First Amendment rights. One was actually Abe Lincoln during the Civil War, and things that are protected by the 14th and the First Amendment were suspended when they passed the Patriot Act. It's only the second time in history that's happened, which makes the climate for all this other stuff much, much worse than it ever was before. So the constitutional protections that we all assume are there aren't there now. The TSA and those guys have power that is kind of closer to the SS than it was to a regular police force.
And Dan Ellsberg also likes to say that all the things that he was accused of, that he was on trial for, that the things that it turned around and bit the Nixon administration in the end that made the administration come down are all now legal. I mean, the things that were illegal that sunk the administration are now legal. So, and also I think that the first point you made about, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was the first thing?
Suspension of the First Amendment.
Oh, yeah, I think.
The 14th and First Amendment rights have only happened twice, and the second time was the Patriot Act, and it's changed the entire landscape. I mean, things that we think we're supposed to be entitled to, we are actually not entitled to, or they're entitled to suspend.
We're in a completely different landscape, literally, in terms of First Amendment rights than we have been in the past, and I think it's really, we need to be much more conscious about all of those, protecting those rights.
All those media people, I mean, I'm one of them, they're supposed to do what Woodward and Bernstein did, now work for giant corporations that may even own Dole. Who knows?
Yeah. Right, so there's a great argument there for independent media making.
And there was one other point you made, I'm sorry, this is what I wanted to respond to, was that when we started this film, I remember thinking, gosh, wouldn't it be great if there was some connection to the Watergate and the Pentagon Papers? And we thought, nah, there really isn't. And then we did that interview with John Dean, which was really a reinterpretation of that history. Yeah, I mean, that isn't how people understood it. It wasn't how we understood it when we started the film. So there really is a direct connection, and I think a lot more people know about Watergate than the Pentagon Papers, so it was a good window.
We had a question over here.
Yeah, could each of you talk a little bit more about self-censorship and instances where you felt swayed toward that and really fought with it, either in these current projects or previous ones?
I don't think I don't like to censor myself, and when you do a film, you struggle mostly with to make a film work, you know, to make it. I mean, it's a hell. I mean, it's not easy to do films, and you are always in moments where you don't believe you can ever make a film again. So you don't think so much about what can happen. Will the bad guys get after me? I mean, the biggest problem is always to create a film that can actually travel at all, to meet an audience. But so for me, it's not an issue, I think. But for journalists who are employed at a newspaper, they go and publish every day. I mean, you know who. I mean, if you work at a local TV station, you know who the big sponsors are. You know, I mean, you know normally who's paying your check, and of course, people all the time go around that. They don't really do some stories we don't hear.
I also think that because we sort of take the vow of poverty being documentary filmmakers, nobody is paying our salaries. So we don't, you know, we have so many sponsors that, you know, thanks to ITVS and POV and all the American, and we got a lot of money from European sources as well for that film. So it really, there's not one boss that can shut us down. So we are in a position to tell the truth very slowly after we've spent years raising funds to tell the film, but it's a different.
In that sense, we are more independent. Yeah. And documentary film is, I think, now more and more the investigative journalism. I mean, because we spend like 2 years or 3 years or 4 years on a project. Of course, in the end we know a lot about it, and you know, a big newspaper, when they still have some investigative journalists, not so many anymore, but when they do it, it's a big investment for newspapers. So they do something where it's within their markets. But we are not so market oriented. We do stories from all over the world because we're interested into it, and there are many of us. There are many filmmakers out there who do stories. So documentary films are now becoming more and more important as breakers of bigger stories, which is kind of interesting. But there is nobody defending us when we get attacked. I mean, New York Times have their own in-house lawyers, you know. But I mean, we don't have those means, and so I think that's the message for me, that we have to see, when we see filmmakers getting attacked, we have to try and look into what's happening and see if we can support.
In your film also, it was fairly evident that the Swedish press came to the story differently, and they did ask themselves questions. They found it to be very odd that they were contacted by Dole. I also want to point out it's rather absurd to me that the Dole executives didn't know that they were on camera when they showed up to your screening in LA. There's a little side note, but how is the structure of the press different in Sweden than it is here?
I wouldn't say that it differs so much. I mean, most of the press is private owned, and it's also like here. The big difference in Sweden and also in Europe is the public service is so much stronger, and public service is funded by license money, and it's not easy to control from the politicians, and it's not easy to control from the markets. So public service is a good
television and radio.
TV and radio, and it's an important source for journalism. I think that also makes other journalists to keep up the standards. So I think that's a big difference. I think in my case, I got a lot of support in Sweden, but remember that, you know, journalists look for good stories, and they also look for stories that they can do without working too much. and my story was a small Swedish.
Is that true for filmmakers also?
Yeah. Well, I will hope. I would love to. Yeah. No, small Swedish filmmaker attacked by big American. It's a good story. But no Swedish media sent journalists to Central America to find out how the banana workers are treated. So the same spin worked also in Sweden. But it
changed the focus.
But the focus, the angle got totally different, and that was bad for Dole and good for me. But in this country, those angles stick all the way. It never changed. No.
Front row?
Yeah, in the course of this conversation so far, I hear a lot of reference to journalism, and I'm trying to reconcile that because, you know, when you talk about journalism, most people regard journalism as an objective institution. But one of the first things that we've learned in our documentary filmmaking class is that documentary film is absolutely not objective. It's absolutely very subjective. And it's also subjective based on the fact that the documentarian is creating a work of art, whereas journalism is not regarded as art. It's just regarded as reporting. So what I want to know is, how do you guys balance the identity of a documentarian with an artist, but yet also negotiating this identity with journalism, you know, which is a different thing than the documentary?
That's a great question.
It's a very good question. I agree that documentary film is a piece of art, and we are not in this. We're not classical investigative journalists. I mean, when I do a film, I try to kick out a lot of facts and information, because information kind of kills the emotional center of the film. I want to focus on fewer things and make them stick harder with people. But I have my audience in front of me, and I want to tell a story so they can believe me or trust me. So my ethics is still the same ethics that I would have as a journalist, I would say. I've been a journalist for many years, so I mean, it's a different way of storytelling, but the ethics are the same, I would say. And I don't think any journalist would say that they're objective. It's kind of a stupid word, I think.
Well, I mean, like,
but I mean,
audience.
you're right.
They might say it.
But it's still a word that's
It'd be
used in
wrong.
the context.
It's used a lot, but they call me. I mean, people called me at 5 o'clock in the morning and say, and I didn't pick up the phone. Mr. Gertten refused to take the call. You know, I mean, it's kind of that's objective journalism.
Bernardo, this is actually a great question for you, because you're covering journalism in your story. So where was the line for you, if at all?
I think it's a great question too, and it's interesting. I think we all have different ways of working, but I think that there are some gaping holes in contemporary journalism, and I think I liken at least what I do to investigate long-form investigative journalism. It's journalism where none of us are free from bias. So the best thing you can do is be honest about those biases up front and say, this is where I'm coming from. And then from that moment forward, tell the story in the best way that you can. For me, from my point of view, I think we're at a moment where it's a transitional period in American journalism. I think, unfortunately, most investigative journalism is very weak. I think we're in a moment where we're reframing what we're doing, and I think a lot of us independent documentarians, for good or for bad, we've come in to fill this vacuum and to tell stories that would be otherwise neglected. When I began my story on the journalists of SETA, I was really blown away that nobody was doing any serious coverage about this storied newspaper, about these journalists that have been murdered. More recently there's been more coverage, but one of the things that we're able to do, because of our stubbornness or because we stayed with a story for so long, so we're able to get a lot deeper into those stories, and I think make editorial decisions that are very different from journalists from a larger news organization who parachutes in, is there for Central America 2 or 3 days, is in Mexico 2 or 3 days, does a 30-minute interview with Daniel Ellsberg. Great. How deep is that going to be? When in my case, we spent 2 years working with and following the journalists of this magazine. I can tell you that my choices are hard-fought choices. So I may not have produced 6 different stories in that time. I only did 1, but I feel very confident about my choices, and I can defend those choices. And for me, hopefully that there's a stronger impact there than that kind of short-form journalism. But it's a great question, and I think all filmmakers struggle with that. At least I do. It's like, how much is traditional journalism in the way we've known it up until now, and how much is art making? And I think for me, the films that are most successful are a blend of those two.
And from my perspective, I started out my life as an educator and a principal of a elementary school, and I always sort of see my role as being an educator, a mass communications educator as well as but I think to really get people, to inspire people and to educate people at the same time, to tell good stories is what I think we try to do. But it's a real challenge that I think to do. I also, the film I'm doing now is contemporary, but the other films I've made have been historical, and to try and do really good research, and to pretend you're getting a PhD in that subject when you make the film, because it's going to be the last word on that subject for a lot of people. They're not going to read the books, the 20 books I read to tell the story. They're going to just see the film, and you better be accurate and you better get it straight. And I pride myself on doing that as well.
There's a question to the far left here.
Yes, I want to congratulate you for your courage, all of you. I haven't seen Bernardo's film yet. We'll be seeing in a few minutes, but Judith, great stuff, Fredrik. And there is a big elephant in the room, however. You're talking about free speech and artistic speech, and one of the great contemporary filmmakers today is sitting rotting in a jail in Iran, of course, Jafar Panahi, who has done some, it's narrative, of course, not documentary films, usually for you guys as children, but I know one of the great friends at the Full Frame Festival, Martin Scorsese, says that all filmmakers in a way are imprisoned until he's freed. How do you feel about that, and do you feel fortunate that, of course, you're not living in Iran and making films, but he said he didn't care, he had to tell the stories, and if that is what, his government does to him, he's willing to, I guess, endure the suffering he has, and people try to get him out. But since we're talking about free speech, and this is narrative versus documentary, it's all the same, it's artistic expression. How does that affect you, and again, do you think about him, or at least the possibilities of what could happen to you in another society?
I mean, I think, I know for right now we have 3 Swedish journalists jailed in Ethiopia and in Eritrea for a long time. And there are a lot of journalists in prison. If you go to the Reporters Without Borders, you find a long list of journalists suffering. And also filmmakers in prison, and we have Ai Weiwei, and we have a lot of people who are fighting the system. And I think what we should do, if we think we live in a democracy where we have the constitutional rights, we should use them. That's the thing we can do in solidarity with the people.
If there's one takeaway.
Can't use them. We have to do that, and that's why we have to look away from the chilling effect and do the stories and say, okay, we have the right. There is a First Amendment in this country. We also have it in our Swedish Constitution. So it's a right, but it's also almost an obligation as a filmmaker and journalist to use those rights.
And I would also argue to be supportive of the individuals who are taking this on, to be supportive of funding availability and public support for these initiatives.
I also think it's a really important case, but I also think it's easy to look at the Iranian context and say, look how terrible it is, and it undoubtedly is. But I think, I don't know enough about Iran. I'm not an Iranian filmmaker. I'm based in the US and Mexico. So my responsibility is to these territories. And I feel like the harder work in some ways is to tell the stories that have an impact here and what we know. I mean, the consequences for us are different, but it's more important to tell these stories here because this is what I know. It behooves us to support independent voices across the globe, but you can't do everything. You have to make choices. And so I think it's important to look at the stories of censorship here, whether it's soft censorship or hard censorship, influence peddling, money. I mean, money is the biggest story. Lobbying is I think is the biggest story, unexplored story.
And I think that for my part, I like to tell stories about people whose lives really are threatened because of the positions they take. And for me, I feel like, I don't actually think about it as a threat to myself any more than getting in a plane to come here was a threat. It's just what I do. But I love to tell the stories of really courageous people. I don't think I'm one of them.
I want to remind everyone really quickly that Reportero is playing at 4:20 p.m. in Cinema 4, in case anyone wants to run out to catch it. I highly recommend. Any other questions out here? Over here?
Judith, your next project, The seems to be the footsteps on the horizon.
It is. Actually, Dan Ellsberg took me with him to this press conference of Julian Assange in London, and I was going to do a film about Julian Assange, and then everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And I realized, too, for me, I got accused at a Q&A of making only films about old men. And I thought, you're right, how come I only make films about old men? So there's a woman who's my character in this film. She's an Icelandic member of parliament. She was the one who produced the collateral murder footage of video that put WikiLeaks on the map. And she's trying to make Iceland into a haven for free speech internationally. And it's a really exciting story, and she's an amazing character, and a single mom with 3 kids, one with autism, you know, a Buddhist and an anarchist, and the daughter of the Iceland's Joan Baez, and an amazing character, and a poet, and really lovely person, so I'm following her story.
I want to see that movie.
Yeah. Me too. Where's the money? Anybody got
Full frame.
Yeah.
2013.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Yes?
I've got a question for Judith. You mentioned that when you approached Daniel that there were several other competing filmmakers. Would you continue with the project if he'd gone somewhere else, or would you have made an unauthorized version? Or
I don't think so. I mean, this film, I think, really took the collaboration of Ellsberg to get to the depth that we did, and he was incredibly collaborative with us. And I think he would have been with anyone he had chosen. But when he finally decided, I think it was the film I had made before, which was about World War II conscientious objectors. He felt like we would treat him fairly and tell the story from the sense of conscience.
If I could follow up, since we're talking about censorship, isn't that a form of censorship too? If he had denied you the opportunity to make the film that you made, and
well,
let's say you want to make a film, and your subject does not want you to make that film. Would you continue with your project?
I wouldn't personally, because I want the cooperation of my subject. I think there are some people who would go ahead, but you know, I think it was, one of them was Errol Morris actually, and he would have, and if I were Dan, I would have chosen Errol Morris too. So at the end, he decided not to make the film and to make a feature instead, which I don't think he's even started to. But you know, it was tough competition, and I think he felt like we had the heart that he wanted to follow that. But I don't think I would make a film about somebody without their total cooperation, which is why I didn't want to make the film about Assange. For me, I needed somebody who really would, you know, share their life with me, and he was not about to do that. So, and he isn't doing that with the people who are making the films about him. So.
Deirdre?
Angelica, can you tell us if the center advises filmmakers in any way what Fredrik's gone through, whether he's right or whether he's wrong? It was simply a matter of David and Goliath. Simply the act of being threatened with being sued can be so financially devastating to a filmmaker. Are there any guidelines that the center is looking at to help filmmakers make this?
We would love to. It's not something we currently have the resources to do. For anyone who isn't familiar with the center, we do a tremendous amount of work in the area of fair use of copyrighted material. And that's very much an expression of free speech. But this is increasingly an issue for filmmakers, and if it's really felt by the documentary community that is where our concentration is needed, then we would certainly be open to having more of that discussion. But at the end of the day, as it is for most filmmakers, it comes down to, you know, our capacity and resources, but this is obviously a very important issue.
Just a quick thank you to this organization, which saved us about $100,000 on our film, and has really made it possible for many films to be made that couldn't without your protection of that right to use fair use of archival footage.
If you could take one step further, if you could find funds for it, it would be really important, because you're the right people, I think.
Shall I pass around a hat?
No, well, I think it's about. I mean, but you have the contacts to do that. I think you're the right people.
Any other questions? How are we doing on time?
You're doing great, actually. We can wrap it up if there are no other questions. So you want to ask more?
There's a couple more over here first.
Sure.
I actually had more comments. Yeah, Bernardo, your life or any of your associates' lives ever threatened directly by the mob?
Luckily for us, I and my team were never threatened directly. The journalists in the film received threats while we were filming, not because of the film, but because of their work. And then 6 weeks ago, the editor of the newspaper, who we profiled in the film, her name is Adela Navarro, she just recently received threats, and so is under protection at various times, depending on what she's doing. The reality is that I had the advantage, I and my team always had the advantage of leaving when things got complicated. And the deal that I made with the journalists, or the agreement that we came to, was that we wanted to maintain editorial autonomy, but that if there was anything that would put them at any kind of direct risk, that I would remove it. There was no question for that. And so the film is very, very carefully structured around certain incidents and events where the dust has settled in most cases. And in one case, things are kind of open. But for the most part, they're things that all of the journalists vetted the film, everyone who participated in the film, and we made no major changes. It's still the story that I wanted to tell. So, thankfully, there were no direct threats. There, remains to be seen what will happen as the film is as it continues its tour and as it builds up momentum. The journalists in the film feel like it's important that their work get out there. The main character of the film is a journalist named Sergio Aro, who's been covering the region for almost 30 years, and his work has really largely gone unrecognized. He's a kind of day-to-day beat reporter, and so I think for him and his colleagues, it's really important that their story be amplified, that it get out into the world.
Yeah, to follow up, how is the film? What's the reaction to the film? Have you gotten feedback from Mexico? People's reactions to the film?
Almost overwhelmingly, it's been a very positive response in Mexico. The press has been very supportive. There's a peace movement in Mexico right now that's members of that group have been very supportive. Right now the film is still traveling through a kind of an alternative network in Mexico. It's not being distributed via a major distributor, and I think that would change things. So far, we've been lucky to have a very, very positive response.
Did you still want to make a comment?
Yeah, just maybe back to Fredrik's kind of question and sort of what happened to you, because, by the way, this is my first film festival. I almost feel I don't belong here, but I'm trying to belong because of one reason. I had a media outlet follow me. I did humanitarian assistance and development now for a long time. And this national news media vilified me to such an extent, in this case it was in Haiti, that I came back completely destroyed. And so I reached out to a filmmaker. I'm from Toronto, so we're actually going to be filming in the fall. So I've never had so much respect for what you do. And I know you take it about poverty now that I'm working with filmmakers, but it really is important. I think there's going to be more people like me who are not really part of this community, lawyers included, who have kind of had it up to here with the regular trash that does come out of the five main sources. So again, congratulations. I think things are going to turn, and you'll have a lot more people who are not part of this community want to contribute money.
I think you're totally right, and I think also what's happening now is that, and I think that's quite natural when the big media is not doing its job anymore. There are still a lot of people who are still interested, who want to get the stories. People who are not afraid of reading about serious stuff. We love to laugh, but we are also interested in what is going on in the world. And so, this film festival is now its 15th year, but there are many festivals all over the world, and there are more and more. So there is a huge audience, and in Toronto there is Hot Dogs, which I think they sell more than 100,000 tickets. So there is a huge audience. So there is, I think, sometimes we tend to sound really depressed, but I think we shouldn't be, because there's a lot of good people out there who want to tell stories and want to share these stories and be part of it. So you're welcome into this community.
I've been honored to be on the jury for this festival, and I can't tell you how good all the films are. I'm watching, it's going to be incredibly hard to choose. It's like, are there no bad films in this batch? Couldn't there be some? Make it easier?
We have some very strong bands of programming, as you can see.
It's fantastic. Really, you've done a great job choosing.
Thank you.
Really
I have to say thank you to all of you. Some people know that I actually used to work in tobacco control
control. So a guy named Jeffrey Wygand, if you want to talk about whistleblowers, is actually a very good friend of mine.
Lowell Bergman's a good friend of mine.
There you go. And you know, the bravery that it takes to do the jobs that you do, whether it's physical harm or whether it's financial harm, I mean, documentarians are my heroes, and I know a lot of people that come to Full Frame's heroes. So can we say thank you to our panel? Bernardo's film is showing right now. Fredrik's film, again, is tomorrow if you want to get tickets. It's an extraordinary film and absolutely chilling that it happened in the United States. And it's a great wake-up call, I think this whole panel was. So thank you for coming.
It's quite fun, too, so it's not the only...
It is. It's actually kind of funny. But it's chilling, too.